My name is Daniel. I'm in my late 30s. For most of my adult life, I was a husband, a father of two, and a senior project manager for a logistics firm that trusted me to keep things running smoothly while others took the credit. If you passed me in an airport terminal or sat next to me on a flight, you wouldn't remember me. That's always been the point. I learned early how to be reliable, quiet, and unremarkable. How to be the person people lean on without ever really looking at. Most people would describe me as steady, safe, predictable. The kind of man who doesn't make waves. At work, I was the dependable one. At home, I was the provider. Even my friends, if I'm honest, saw me as background noise to their louder lives. No one ever thought of me as reckless, impulsive, or capable of blowing up his own world. I didn't think so either. This is not a story about passion or escape. It's not a confession meant to shock you, and it's not a revenge tale dressed up as regret. What happened to me didn't begin with desire. It began with erosion, with small silences, with being unseen for so long that one moment of attention felt like oxygen. I cheated once during a business trip. One night, one decision. What I called a mistake lasted one night. What I lost will last the rest of my life. This story is about the quiet cost of that night. About how a single fracture can travel backward and forward through time, rewriting 10 years of marriage, reshaping the way my children look at me, and forcing me to confront a version of myself I never believed existed. It's about how trust doesn't explode, it drains, and how consequences don't arrive with sirens, but with paperwork, silence, and the absence of voices that used to call you dad. You won't hear villains in this story. There are no monsters, no dramatic showdowns, no screaming matches in the rain. My ex-wife isn't cruel. My children aren't vindictive. Even I'm not the caricature you might expect. What makes this harder and more honest is that everyone involved tried, in their own way, to do the right thing once the truth was out. I'm telling this story because it's easy to reduce infidelity to headlines and hot takes. Because we like clean morals and loud lessons. But real life doesn't work that way. Real life is quieter, slower, and far more permanent. If you stay with me, you'll hear who I was before anyone doubted me, how that trust cracked, and what it feels like to live with the kind of loss that doesn't heal by moving on, but by carrying it correctly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm offering honesty, plain, uncomfortable, and complete. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever underestimated the weight of a single choice simply because everything else in your life felt under control? Before everything unraveled, I was the kind of man people trusted without thinking about why. Trust, when it's steady, becomes invisible. That was my role in almost every room I entered. At work, I was the one copied last on emails, but called first when something went wrong. I didn't dominate meetings. I summarized them. I didn't argue loudly. I followed through quietly. Executives liked me because I made their decisions look smooth. Colleagues liked me because I didn't compete for attention. No one worried about me leaving. Men like me are assumed to stay. At home, the pattern was similar. I woke up earlier than everyone else. Packed lunches, checked calendars, and paid bills. I remembered dentist appointments, school spirit days, and permission slips. My wife used to joke that I was the infrastructure of our family, the wiring in the walls, necessary, unseen. She didn't mean it cruelly, she meant it accurately. Our marriage looked solid from the outside. 10 years together, 2 kids, no scandals, no dramatic fights. We didn't throw things or scream at each other. We negotiated life the way professionals negotiate contracts, efficiently, politely, with very little wasted emotion. Friends admired us for that. They said we were stable. What they didn't see was how stability slowly replaced intimacy, how appreciation turned into assumption, how my presence became a given, like gravity, always there, never discussed. Even my children absorbed this version of me without realizing it. I was the dad who showed up. Always, but rarely stood out. I wasn't the loud, fun one. I wasn't the disciplinarian either. I was the constant, the background hum of safety. When kids draw families, they draw faces. They don't draw foundations. I tell you this, not to ask for sympathy. I wasn't mistreated. I wasn't abused. I wasn't ignored in any dramatic sense. I was respected, relied upon, and trusted, but I was no longer noticed, and there is a quiet loneliness that comes with being essential, yet interchangeable. Looking back, I can see how comfortable everyone became with my steadiness. My wife spoke for both of us in social settings. At first, I appreciated it. I never liked attention. Over time, it became the default. Decisions were made, plans agreed to, narratives formed, and I nodded along because nothing felt worth interrupting the flow. I told myself this was maturity, that real men don't need validation, that providing was a form of love that didn't require applause, and for a long time, that belief sustained me. The truth is, I didn't feel unhappy. I felt neutral, flattened, like a life lived on low volume, and when you live that way long enough, you stop noticing what's missing. You convince yourself that this is just what adulthood feels like. That's why no one, least of all me, would have predicted what came next. People think betrayal comes from excess, too much desire, too much ego, too much appetite. Mine came from scarcity, from one moment where someone looked at me and didn't see infrastructure, or reliability, or background noise, but a man. And because I had spent so long believing I was immune to that kind of weakness, I didn't recognize the danger until it had already passed through me. Who I was to them was simple, dependable, safe, predictable. Who I was to myself was less clear, but I didn't question it. Not yet. That questioning would come later, quietly, without warning, and once it began, it didn't stop. The first crack didn't look like a betrayal. It didn't even look like a problem. That's why it stayed with me. It happened on a Tuesday evening, ordinary, in every possible way. The kids were at the table finishing homework. The TV was on in the background, volume low. I was standing in the kitchen, reading an email on my phone, while waiting for the kettle to boil. My wife was telling a story about her day, something about a disagreement at work. I was listening. I always listened. At some point, she paused and said, "Anyway, I already told them we'd host Thanksgiving this year." She said it casually, like she was narrating something that had already resolved itself. I remember looking up and asking calmly, "You did?" She nodded. "Yeah, it just made sense. You don't mind, right?" The question came after the decision. That was the cut. It wasn't about Thanksgiving. I didn't hate hosting. I didn't have a conflict. If she had asked first, I probably would have agreed. But something about the order of things, decide first, consult later, registered differently. It was subtle, almost invisible. Everyone else in the room stayed in their lane. The kids kept writing. The kettle kept heating. I said, "Sure, that's fine." And it was, practically speaking. Emotionally, something had shifted. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment, not with anger, but with curiosity. When had my consent become assumed? When had my presence turned into a checkbox? I didn't frame it that way at the time. I just felt reduced, slightly. Like someone had erased a line from a document and assumed it wouldn't be missed. Moments like that are easy to dismiss. In healthy relationships, people make calls on behalf of the team. There's efficiency in that. I knew this intellectually, so I filed the feeling away under "not worth bringing up." But the mind doesn't forget what the mouth chooses not to say. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Small, polite, harmless on their own. My name was left off a conversation because you're fine either way. A joke was made at my expense in front of friends that lasted a second too long. A plan changed without checking because you're flexible. Each time I smiled, each time I agreed, and each time something inside me took note. What made it harder was that no one else noticed. If I had pushed back, it would have looked unreasonable. Overreacting. Who gets upset about Thanksgiving plans or casual jokes? There was no villain here, just momentum. At work, it mirrored itself. A junior colleague presented an idea I had spent weeks developing. My contribution was acknowledged in passing. Daniel helped refine this, and then forgotten. Applause moved on. I stayed seated. I told myself this was the price of being low ego, being a team player, and for years, that logic had served me well. But now, the silence felt heavier. Less like discipline, more like erasure. The truth is, I didn't want confrontation. I wanted recognition without asking for it. I wanted someone to pause and say, "Wait, what do you think?" And because no one did, I kept shrinking my expectations until they fit the space I was given. That's how small cuts work. They don't bleed, they don't demand attention, they just change the shape of things. By the time the business trip came up, the one everyone now asks about, I was already carrying a quiet inventory of moments where I had been present but not consulted, reliable but not considered. None of these excuses for what I did, but it explains how I got close enough to the edge to fall. The first small cut didn't hurt, it just made it easier to wound later. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It becomes routine long before it becomes obvious. By the time I noticed the pattern, I had already participated in it, by adjusting, by lowering my expectations, by convincing myself that what I was feeling wasn't important enough to name. At home, it showed up in logistics, schedules finalized without my input, purchases made because we needed it anyway, conversations that began with decisions already framed as facts. I was informed, not consulted, and every time, I told myself the same story. This is what partnership looks like when things are efficient. The dangerous thing about rationalization is how reasonable it sounds. I told myself my wife was overwhelmed, that she carried a lot mentally, that she trusted my flexibility. All of those things were true, and because they were true, they made it easier to ignore the part that wasn't, that my voice was slowly being removed from the equation. When I did speak up, rarely, it came out softly, carefully worded, apologetic even. It's not a big deal, but next time maybe we could. And because I framed my needs as optional, they were treated that way. At work, I became known as the man who could be counted on to fill the gaps, which is another way of saying the man whose time belonged to everyone else. I stayed late without complaint, took on projects without credit, fixed mistakes that weren't mine. And when promotions were discussed, my name surfaced briefly, then drifted away. I watched louder colleagues advance faster. I watched risk-takers get rewarded. I watched my steadiness become something others stepped on to reach higher ground. And I let it happen, because silence had become familiar, predictable, safe. There's a certain pride in being the person who doesn't need to be seen. I wore that pride like armor. I told myself that wanting acknowledgement was vanity, that restraint was strength, that if I just kept showing up, the math would work out eventually. But human relationships don't run on math, they run on perception, and the perception of me had shifted from equal to accessory. The thing about being underestimated is that it's comfortable at first. Expectations drop, pressure eases, people stop demanding more from you because they assume you won't ask for more from them. And if you're conflict avoidant, that can feel like peace. I mistook quiet for harmony. Looking back, I can see how I trained people how to treat me. Every time I swallowed a reaction, every time I smiled through a dismissal, every time I chose "it's fine" over "it matters," I reinforced the narrative that my inner life was negotiable. No one forced that role on me. I accepted it. By the time the business trip was scheduled, a routine 3-day conference in another city, I didn't feel excited or nervous. I felt relieved, not because I wanted to escape my family, but because I wanted to exist somewhere without a predefined script. On that trip, no one knew me as the reliable husband, the infrastructure dad, or the dependable project manager. I was just a man with a name badge and a hotel key card. No history, no expectations. That anonymity felt lighter than it should have. I didn't wake up that morning intending to betray anyone. I woke up intending to attend meetings, shake hands, and fly home. But when you've normalized being unseen, the first moment someone looks at you directly can feel like gravity shifting. And because I had spent months, years, convincing myself that my needs were optional, I had no practiced language for resisting temptation when it appeared as understanding. That's the part people don't like to hear. They want a clear line between loyalty and betrayal. They want to believe good people don't drift. But drift is exactly what happens when you normalize small losses, when you train yourself to accept less, when you confuse endurance with virtue. By the time I realized something was wrong, it already felt normal, and normal is the most dangerous place to live. Roles don't come with contracts. No one sits you down and explains what's expected. They form quietly, through repetition, through what you tolerate, through what you never correct. By the time I became aware of mine, it had already solidified. I was the reliable one, the man who would handle it, whatever it happened to be. At home, that meant I was trusted with execution, not direction. I carried out plans efficiently and visibly, without emotional friction. At work, it meant I was assigned responsibility, without authority, the engine, not the driver. People weren't cruel about it. That's what made it harder to name. Cruelty invites resistance. Politeness dissolves it. My wife once said, half smiling, "I don't worry when you're around. Things just work." She meant it as praise. I received it as confirmation of my role. I wasn't the one people checked in with. I was the one they leaned on, so they didn't have to. The problem with being useful is that usefulness gets consumed. I noticed how conversations shifted when I entered a room. Decisions were already made, opinions already aligned. My input, when asked, was sought for validation, not direction. And because I hated conflict, I complied, I refined, I supported. I told myself this was love, that being needed was enough. But need is not the same as being chosen. At some point, I stopped offering ideas unless asked, stopped interrupting narratives that didn't include me. I edited myself down to fit the role I had been given, and in doing so, I made that role easier to maintain. What I didn't realize then was that invisibility is not neutral. It erodes identity. When no one expects you to change, grow, or want something different, you begin to believe that you shouldn't. That belief followed me on the business trip. At the conference, I wasn't assigned a role yet. No one knew how reliable I was. No one assumed I'd stay late or smooth things over. For the first time in years, my presence wasn't pre-labeled. When a colleague from another company asked what I thought about a panel discussion, she waited for the answer, didn't interrupt, didn't redirect, just listened. It was a small thing, smaller than any dramatic temptation story would suggest. But it landed heavily because it contrasted so sharply with my daily life. I didn't flirt, I didn't cross lines, not yet, but I felt something wake up, a version of myself that remembered having edges, opinions, weight. That's what the role had taken from me, not love, not loyalty, but dimensionality. I want to be clear, my wife did not assign me this role maliciously. My colleagues did not conspire to diminish me. I helped write the script by never revising it. But roles, once established, become expectations, and expectations become limits. I had been limited so long that I mistook the absence of limits for freedom. When people later ask me, "Why didn't you just talk to your wife?" I understood the logic of the question. I just didn't have the language for the answer at the time, because when you've been reliable for too long, asking to be seen feels like asking for too much. So I stayed quiet. And silence, as I would learn too late, is not passive. It's participatory. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no discovery, no irreversible act. It was quieter than that, almost forgettable if you weren't living inside it. It happened on the second evening of the business trip. The conference had ended for the day, and the hotel bar was filling with the low, tired energy of people who had talked all day and didn't want to go back to their rooms yet. I ordered a drink I didn't need and sat at a small table near the window, watching rain slide down the glass. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I wasn't trying to be anywhere else. I was just present. That was unusual for me. At home, my presence always had a function. I was either fixing something, planning something, or anticipating someone else's need. Sitting without purpose felt almost irresponsible. A woman from one of the afternoon panels recognized me and asked if she could join. We talked about the conference at first, surface level, professional. She asked thoughtful questions. She listened without scanning the room for someone more important. When I spoke, she didn't rush me. At one point, she asked, "Do you always think this carefully before you answer?" It wasn't flirtation, it was an observation, and it caught me off guard. I laughed and said something dismissive, the way I always did, but inside, something tightened. No one had commented on how I thought in years. They commented on what I did, how reliable I was, how quickly I handled things, not on the interior process. The shift happened later, back in my room. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, tie loosened, jacket draped over a chair. The room was quiet in that impersonal hotel way. No family noise, no reminders of roles. Just me. Arius. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of choice. Not about infidelity, about identity. I realized I had been moving through my life as if everything important had already been decided. As if my role was fixed and my desires irrelevant. That night, the possibility, just the possibility, that I could be more than what I had been assigned felt destabilizing. I didn't act on it then. That's important. The shift wasn't behavior, it was permission. Permission to acknowledge that something in me had been neglected. Permission to feel curious instead of resigned. Permission to notice how good it felt to be seen without being useful. That permission scared me more than temptation ever could have. Because once you admit that a part of you is starving, you have to decide whether to feed it or deny it consciously. I slept poorly that night, not with guilt, but with awareness. Every familiar defense, "This is just how life is. Be grateful. Don't rock the boat," felt thinner, less convincing. The next day, everything looked the same on the surface. I attended sessions, took notes, smiled politely, but internally, the script had changed. I was no longer numb to my own absence. That awareness followed me like a shadow. It didn't push me, it waited. And waiting, I would learn, is powerful. After that night, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been automatic, a reflex honed over years of keeping things smooth. Now, it was deliberate, observant, chosen. I returned home from the trip without incident. No confessions, no visible cracks. I hugged my kids, unpacked my suitcase, and listened to my wife talk about the week. Everything looked the same, but internally, I had stepped a few inches to the side of my own life, just enough to see it clearly. I noticed how often my wife spoke around me instead of with me, how plans were narrated, not discussed. I noticed how my agreement was assumed before it was offered, and instead of correcting it, I let it happen. Not out of spite, out of clarity. I wanted to understand the shape of the dynamic before disturbing it. I wanted to know how much of my invisibility was situational and how much was structural. At work, I did the same. I stopped volunteering extra context, stopped rescuing meetings from inefficiency. I still did my job well, but no more than that. When my name was left off a presentation, I didn't correct it. When a deadline slipped because someone else hadn't delivered, I let the delay stand. People interpreted this as compliance, as continued reliability. No one suspected observation. Silence is often mistaken for weakness because it doesn't announce itself, but silence, when chosen, creates space, and space reveals patterns. What I saw wasn't malicious. It was worse than that. It was comfortable. People were comfortable not checking in with me, comfortable assuming, comfortable relying on my consistency without acknowledging my presence. And because nothing broke when I withdrew slightly, the system revealed how replaceable I had become in the emotional sense. At home, my wife filled the space easily. She always had. She was capable, decisive, and used to carrying momentum. My quiet didn't alarm her. If anything, it validated the belief that everything was fine. That realization hurt more than any argument would have. I began documenting, not formally, not with notes, but mentally. Who spoke first? Who decided? Who adjusted? Who disappeared? I wasn't planning anything yet. I wasn't plotting an exit. I was gathering truth. People think silence is the absence, but it's actually present, without interference. And when you stop interfering, you learn exactly how little room has been reserved for you. The temptation, the emotional kind, didn't come from a person. It came from the idea that I could choose differently, that I could stop being the easiest option in every room. That's what people misunderstand about infidelity when it happens quietly. It's not always about desire. Sometimes it's about agency. I didn't speak up because speaking up would have forced confrontation, and confrontation would have required me to articulate needs I wasn't sure I was allowed to have. So I stayed quiet, watched, listened. And in that listening, something irreversible began to form. Not a plan, but a decision about who I would no longer be. What they never noticed was how much I was paying attention. When you've been underestimated for long enough, observation becomes second nature. You learn how rooms work, how decisions are actually made, who holds power, and who only borrows it. For years, I used that skill to support others, quietly. Now, I turned it inward. I started noticing patterns that had always been there, just never named. At home, I noticed how emotional labor flowed in one direction. My wife was expressive, articulate, and confident in her assessments. I was responsive, adaptable, and accommodating. When tension appeared, it was smoothed over, not resolved. We avoided discomfort the way professionals avoid risk, by minimizing exposure. I realized how rarely anyone asked me what I wanted. Not because they didn't care, but because I had taught them that I didn't require asking. At work, the pattern was sharper. I began tracking contributions, not obsessively, but accurately. Who proposed ideas? Who refined them? Who presented them? Who received credit? I noticed how often my fingerprints were on outcomes my name was absent from. I noticed how often I was brought in after decisions were made to make it work. And I noticed something else, something unsettling. When I pulled back, nothing collapsed immediately. Projects are still moved, the family schedule still ran, the world did not pause to ask where I had gone. That hurt more than being dismissed ever had. So I stopped assuming my presence was essential and started treating it as optional by others' standards. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't threaten. I didn't demand change. I simply let reality speak. And reality said, "You are relied upon, but not anchored." During this time, the emotional connection I had felt on the trip lingered, not as longing, but as contrast. It reminded me what it felt like to be engaged with rather than used, seen rather than assumed. I want to be very clear here. I did not begin an affair during this period, not yet. What I began was preparation, not for betrayal, but for truth. I read about long-term relationships, about emotional neglect, about how resentment forms in people who never express their needs. I didn't Google how to cheat or how to leave. I searched for language, for frameworks, for explanations that didn't reduce me to a stereotype. I also began to imagine consequences, not as fear, but as math. What would it mean if I spoke up? What would it cost if I didn't? What would change if I stayed exactly as I was for another 10 years? Those questions didn't have immediate answers, but they sharpened my awareness. At work, I began positioning quietly, updating documentation, clarifying responsibilities in writing, not to protect myself legally, but to see my own role clearly. I wanted to know what would happen if I stopped compensating for gaps that weren't mine. At home, I did something similar, though less visible. I stopped smoothing over emotional discomfort. If something felt off, I let it sit. I didn't fix it immediately. I watched how long it would take for someone else to notice. Often no one did. This wasn't punishment, it was information. People think preparation looks like action, like movement, like plotting, but real preparation often looks like stillness, like someone standing quietly in the corner, watching the structure of a room before deciding where to place weight. I wasn't planning to destroy my marriage, I was trying to understand it, and what I learned was difficult to unlearn, that I had become predictable, and predictability had turned me into background. That knowledge didn't make me angry, it made me careful. Because once you see how invisible you've become, you have two choices: demand to be seen, or step into a place where seeing you costs nothing. That choice was approaching, slowly, quietly, inevitably. The private reveal didn't arrive with excitement. There was no rush, no sense of triumph. What came instead was clarity, cold, steady, and deeply unsettling. It happened on an ordinary afternoon at work. I was reviewing a project timeline when I noticed an inconsistency, small at first, the kind that usually gets brushed aside. A delivery milestone had been shifted forward without documentation. Not impossible, but unlikely. I traced it back through emails, approvals, and version histories. What I found wasn't malicious, it was careless, and it revealed something important. Several decisions that carried my name, as responsible party, had been made without my involvement. My authority was implied, not exercised. If something went wrong, the accountability would land on me. If it went right, the credit would drift elsewhere. I sat with that realization longer than I needed to. For years, I had assumed my value lay in execution, in keeping systems running, in absorbing friction so others didn't have to. But what I saw in front of me was leverage, not in a manipulative sense, but in a structural one. I occupied a position where my absence wouldn't cause immediate chaos, but my withdrawal would expose assumptions, and assumptions, once exposed, make people uncomfortable. That same evening, at home, I noticed a parallel. My wife mentioned a financial decision she had already made, routine, reasonable, within our means. She said it the way one reports the weather. I nodded, then she added, "I figured you'd be fine with it." Again, the sentence wasn't cruel, it was efficient. But in that efficiency was the reveal. My agreement had become a formality. And suddenly, I saw the pattern clearly. At work, at home, everywhere. I wasn't being overruled, I was being pre-approved. That's a dangerous place to live, because it feels like trust, while quietly removing agency. The leverage I discovered wasn't power over others, it was power over myself. I realized that no one was forcing me to stay silent. No one was demanding my invisibility. I was cooperating with it because it kept everything calm, predictable, stable. And stability, I had learned, can be its own form of anesthesia. The revelation wasn't that I could leave, it was that I could choose, and that I had been avoiding that choice by pretending there wasn't one. That night, lying awake beside my wife, I didn't feel resentment. I felt distance. Not emotional distance, structural distance. Like standing on a familiar bridge and suddenly seeing how narrow it really is. I understood then that if I continued as I was, nothing would change. Not because others were unwilling, but because the system didn't require change to function. And I understood something else, something harder to admit, that being seen elsewhere would be easier than renegotiating visibility here. That thought didn't make me proud, it made me honest. There was no celebration in this clarity, no sense of winning, only the sobering awareness that my life had been coasting on momentum, and momentum doesn't ask where you want to go. The leverage wasn't something I planned to use, it was something I could no longer ignore. Once you see the mechanics of your own disappearance, you can't unsee them. And once you see them, every choice carries weight. The decision point didn't arrive as a fork in the road. There were no signs pointing left or right. It felt more like standing in a room where every door had always been open, but I had convinced myself I wasn't allowed to touch the handles. Now I could see them. I could speak up. That was one option. Sit down with my wife, articulate what I'd been carrying, explain the slow erosion of visibility, and ask for a renegotiation of how we moved through life together. It was the option people later insisted was the obvious one, the healthy one, the adult one. But when I imagined it honestly, I didn't imagine relief. I imagined translation, explaining years of quiet in a language I had never practiced, asking for space in a system that had been optimized around my silence. I imagined her listening. She would have listened, but also defending, reframing, solving, turning my internal shift into a problem to be managed. I wasn't sure I could survive being managed again. I could do nothing. That was another option. Continue as infrastructure, accept the trade. Stability for invisibility. Many people do this their entire lives. They numb the part of themselves that wants to be chosen and call it maturity. I had done it well for a long time. But now that I had named what was missing, I knew I would feel the absence every day. And resentment, once conscious, doesn't stay quiet. There was a third option, the one I didn't want to admit even to myself. It wasn't about sex. It wasn't about romance. It was about confirmation, about stepping into a space where I wasn't pre-approved, pre-labeled, or pre-assigned. A space where my presence would have to be actively chosen. That option terrified me because it was irreversible, not because of the act itself, but because of what it would reveal about me. Once crossed, I wouldn't be able to pretend this was all theoretical. I spent days inside that tension, functioning outwardly, calculating inwardly. I weighed consequences the way I weighed risks at work, carefully, thoroughly, without drama. I knew exactly what I stood to lose: my marriage, daily access to my children, the moral high ground I had quietly occupied for years, the image others had of me as the steady one. What I stood to gain was less tangible and more dangerous. Proof that I still existed as an independent self. People like to imagine that decisions like this are impulsive, that they happen in moments of weakness or intoxication. That wasn't my experience. Mine felt disturbingly calm, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper, and I was just catching up to it. The night it happened, there was no music swelling in the background, no dramatic internal monologue, just a series of small, deliberate steps that felt heavier with each one. I remember thinking, after this, you won't be able to tell yourself the same stories. And that, more than guilt, was what made my hands shake. I crossed the line, not because I believed it would fix anything, but because I believed it would clarify everything. That belief was wrong, in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Because clarity doesn't always arrive cleanly, sometimes it arrives as wreckage. And once you choose the irreversible option, the future stops being hypothetical. It starts collecting interest. After it happened, nothing exploded. That was the most unsettling part. I came home. I hugged my children. I unpacked my suitcase. I kissed my wife on the cheek while she told me about a meeting that had run long. The house smelled the same. The routines held. Life did not react to what I had done. Guilt didn't arrive the way movies promise it will. There was no immediate panic, no urge to confess, no collapse onto the bathroom floor. What came instead was a heavy, sober stillness, like standing in a room after something fragile has broken and realizing no one else heard it. From the outside, I was unchanged. On the inside, I began moving differently. Not dramatically, not urgently, quietly. I became careful with language. I noticed how often I used we when I meant I. I stopped volunteering for future commitments without thinking through what they actually cost me. I listened more than I spoke, not out of passivity, but out of calibration. At work, I did something similar. I formalized boundaries that had previously been implicit. I asked for things to be put in writing. I clarified the scope, not aggressively, professionally. People didn't push back, they adjusted. The system flexed around the change without questioning why. That told me something important. My silence had never been required. It had simply been convenient. At home, the silence was more complicated. I didn't pull away from my children. If anything, I became more present with them. I listened harder. I noticed the way my daughter paused before telling stories, the way my son sought approval with quick glances. I stored those moments carefully, the way people do when they sense something is finite but don't yet know why. With my wife, I stayed steady, kind, predictable. The version of me she trusted remained intact on the surface. That duplicity sits heavily in my chest, even now. Not because I was hiding passion or excitement, but because I was hiding distance. Distance is harder to forgive than anger. I began thinking in timelines. What would it look like if this truth surfaced next month, next year? What would it cost my children, not just in trust, but in continuity? I researched quietly, not escape routes, but realities. Custody arrangements, co-parenting schedules, the mechanics of a life split in two. None of it felt real yet. It felt preparatory, like reading evacuation instructions while the building is still standing. People often assume that betrayal is followed by recklessness. My experience was the opposite. I became more controlled, not less. More deliberate, more aware of how much damage silence can hide before it detonates. No one noticed the shift because I didn't demand anything. I didn't argue. I didn't withdraw affection dramatically. I simply stopped compensating emotionally. And because I had always done that work invisibly, its absence wasn't immediately detected. That's the danger of being the quiet one. When you stop holding things together, the delay between cause and effect is long enough for denial to settle in. There were moments, small ones, when I considered undoing it, confessing early, absorbing the blast before it spread. But each day that passed made that choice heavier. Confession doesn't freeze time, it reorders it. I told myself I was protecting my children by waiting, by stabilizing, by thinking ahead. Some of that was true. Some of it was fear dressed up as strategy. I moved through those weeks like someone carrying a glass object through a crowded room, careful not to bump into anything, aware that one misstep would shatter everything. And all the while, the cost was accruing. Silence doesn't erase actions, it just delays their consequences. The consequences didn't arrive as accusations. They arrived in confusion. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. My wife began asking questions that didn't sound like questions. Are you tired? Work stressful lately? You've been quiet. She said them casually, in passing, like someone checking the weather. I answered honestly, but narrowly, yes, a bit. Nothing serious. She accepted those answers because I had trained her to. I had always been the one who handled things internally, the one who didn't need a follow-up. But something had changed in the atmosphere. Not the structure, just the air. At work, I noticed a similar shift. People began double-checking with me more often, looping me back in, asking clarifying questions that they hadn't asked before. It wasn't respect, exactly. It was uncertainty. The system had adjusted to my silence, and now it was noticing that the silence was no longer doing the same work. At home, the kids sensed it before anyone else. Children don't understand secrets, but they understand absence. Emotional absence. My daughter became more talkative, filling space with stories that didn't need telling. My son grew quieter, watching more closely. Neither of them knew why the rhythm felt off. They just knew it did. That knowledge sat in my chest like a weight. The loss they felt wasn't tied to a revelation. It was tied to a shift in alignment. I was still there, but not anchored in the same way. And when someone has been your constant, even a small deviation registers. One night, my wife asked, "Did I do something?" The question landed harder than any accusation could have. I said no, and in that moment, I believed I was telling the truth. She hadn't caused what I had done, but I could see how the lack of explanation created a vacuum, and how that vacuum naturally filled with self-blame. That's when I understood something brutal. Silence doesn't just protect the person keeping it, it reallocates pain. Because I wasn't naming the truth, others were naming possibilities, and those possibilities hurt in quieter, more corrosive ways. She tried to bridge the gap, suggested date nights, asked more questions, checked in more frequently, not out of suspicion, but out of concern. The system was trying to self-correct without knowing what had gone wrong. Watching that happen without intervening felt like standing behind glass. I could see the effort, the care, and I could see how late it was. At work, projects that had once flowed through me seamlessly began stalling. Not catastrophically, just enough to draw attention. People realized how much invisible labor I had been providing when it stopped arriving automatically. The phrase, "we'll need to rethink this," came up more often. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years disappearing into systems, and now that I had stepped back, the systems were feeling it, but still didn't know why. That's how consequences often begin, not with exposure, but with imbalance. No one was angry yet, no one was blaming, but everyone was adjusting to a version of me that no longer matched the role they had built around. And adjustment always comes with friction. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, watching my wife move around the space we had shared for a decade, and thinking, she feels it, she just doesn't know what it is. That knowledge didn't make me feel powerful, it made me feel cowardly. Because at that point, I wasn't just living with the consequences of my action, I was prolonging them. And prolonging consequences doesn't soften them, it spreads them. By the time the truth surfaced, the damage had already learned how to live without explanation. It didn't come out in a dramatic confession. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no moment where time froze and everything split cleanly in two. It came out the way real disasters often do, through exhaustion. My wife found the message by accident, not a detailed exchange, not proof stacked neatly into certainty. Just enough to make the question unavoidable. She didn't confront me immediately. That's the part people don't expect. She went quiet first, observant, polite, too controlled. The house filled with a kind of silence I had never heard before, one that didn't ask questions because it already suspected the answers. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with anger, it was with precision. Is there something I need to know? In that moment, every version of repair I had rehearsed collapsed. All the careful timing, all the imagined explanations, all the ideas about protecting the kids by waiting. There is no good time to reveal a truth like that. There are only late ones. I told her, not defensively, not theatrically, plainly. One night, one decision. No excuses, no shifting blame, just facts. I watched her listen the way professionals listen, processing information before emotion. That scared me more than rage ever could have. She didn't cry at first. She asked clarifying questions, dates, context, whether it was over, whether there had been more. Each answer landed somewhere I couldn't reach. When the emotion finally arrived, it wasn't explosive, it was hollow. She said very quietly, "I don't know where to put this." That sentence still echoes in me. Because betrayal doesn't just break trust, it breaks orientation. It forces someone to reevaluate years of memory through a new lens, and there is no instruction manual for that. I tried to fix it, of course I did. I offered transparency, counseling, time, space. Whatever she wanted, I said the right things, I meant them, but meaning doesn't rewind time, and remorse doesn't restore innocence. She wasn't angry all the time, she was disoriented. Some days, she wanted to talk. Some days she couldn't look at me. Some days she functioned like everything was normal, and those days were the hardest. Because normal, after truth, is unbearable. The children sensed the shift immediately. We hadn't told them yet, but they knew something had cracked. The air was heavier. Conversations ended too quickly. Laughter felt borrowed. I watched my wife try to carry herself with dignity, while absorbing a pain she never consented to. And I realized something devastating. Even if she stayed, even if she forgave me someday, the marriage we had was already gone. You can't return to a place once you've learned it was never as safe as you believed. That's when panic arrived. Not the loud kind, but the slow, suffocating kind. The realization that some losses don't announce themselves as endings, they just stop being repairable. I had waited too long to speak, when speaking might have mattered. I had chosen clarity through action instead of conversation. And now, conversation couldn't undo what action had already declared. People say, if you're sorry, you should have thought of that before. They're right. But what they don't say is how much regret lives in the space between intention and consequence. How it settles in quietly without relief. By the time I understood what I had truly risked, the decision was no longer mine to reverse. And that is the hardest truth of all. Some mistakes don't ask for your readiness. They only ask for your ownership. The confrontation people imagine never came. There was no night when voices rose until the neighbors heard. No slammed doors. No list of accusations was hurled across the room. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways, far more final. We sat at the dining table after the kids had gone to bed. The house was too tidy, the way it gets when no one knows what to do with their hands. She had a notebook in front of her. I noticed that detail immediately. She had always used notebooks when she needed to stay grounded. She didn't ask why. That surprised me. She said, I need to understand what happens next. The sentence wasn't angry, it wasn't wounded, it was procedural, and that was when I knew the confrontation wasn't about punishment, it was about orientation. She was trying to figure out how to stand in a world that had shifted under her feet. I told her I would answer anything she wanted to ask. I meant it, but she chose carefully. She asked whether I had felt unhappy. She asked whether I still loved her. She asked whether I believed I would have done this 10 years earlier. I answered honestly, even when honesty didn't help me. Yes, I had felt unseen. Yes, I loved her. But love hadn't protected me from making a catastrophic choice. No, I didn't think the man I was at 28 would have crossed that line. She nodded, wrote something down, and closed the notebook. Then she said something I wasn't prepared for. I don't think you're a bad person. That sentence should have felt like mercy. Instead, it felt like grief. Because what she was really saying was that this wasn't about villainy. It was about incompatibility that had gone unexamined for too long. And a line that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. We talked about the children, carefully, practically, who would tell them, when, how to minimize the shock without lying. She was composed in a way that made me ache with admiration and shame at the same time. At one point, I apologized again, not defensively, not desperately, just plain. She listened and said, I believe you're sorry. I just don't know if sorry fits into the future I can imagine now. That was the moment the marriage ended, not legally, but structurally. There was no rage to push against, no emotion to argue with, just a quiet acknowledgement that trust, once broken at that depth, doesn't respond to effort the way people want it to. We didn't decide everything that night. We didn't have to. The shape of the outcome was already clear. Counseling would come. Logistics would follow. Conversations with the kids would be scheduled, not avoided. What stayed with me most was how calm it all was. People think calm means forgiveness is possible. Sometimes it means acceptance has already begun. When we stood up from the table, she didn't touch me, not out of anger, but because the gesture no longer belonged in the same way. I slept in the guest room that night. The house felt larger, emptier, like a place that had stopped echoing. That was the confrontation, not loud, not cruel, just precise enough to leave no doubt. I am not the man I was before, but I am also not the man I feared I would become. After the separation, life reorganized itself in ways that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. Apartments replace houses. Calendars are split in half. Time with your children becomes measured, intentional, and painfully precious. Nothing about it is dramatic. It's logistical, administrative, and quietly devastating. I no longer define myself by reliability alone. That version of me collapsed under its own weight. I learned too late that being dependable without being visible is a slow form of self-erasure. Now, I speak earlier, not louder, earlier. I name discomfort before it calcifies. I don't wait for permission to exist in rooms I occupy. That doesn't make me aggressive, it makes me present. With my children, I am careful not to perform redemption. I don't overcompensate. I don't ask for reassurance. I show up consistently, answer questions honestly at an age-appropriate level, and accept that trust is something they may rebuild slowly, or differently than before. There are days when my daughter looks at me the way she always did. There are days when she doesn't. I don't rush either. I understand now that trust, once fractured, doesn't return on command. It returns, if at all, through repetition, without expectation. With my ex-wife, our relationship is respectful, contained, and clear. We speak about logistics, about the kids, occasionally about shared memories that still belong to both of us. We do not pretend friendship. We do not perform hostility. We coexist. I no longer expect forgiveness as a reward for remorse. That expectation was part of the immaturity I didn't recognize in myself until it was too late. What surprises people is that I'm not angry, not at her, not at myself in the way that corrodes. Anger would suggest I believe something was taken from me unjustly. What was taken by my own hand. That clarity has been painful, but clean. I still believe in commitment. I still believe in marriage. But I no longer believe silence is strength. I no longer believe endurance is love. And I no longer confuse being needed with being known. The version of me that cheated wasn't a monster. He was a man who had avoided difficult conversations for so long that he chose a catastrophic action over an uncomfortable one. That doesn't excuse him, but it explains him. An explanation is not absolution, it's responsibility. If there is a dominance in who I am now, it's not over others. It's over my own avoidance, over the impulse to disappear in order to keep peace, over the fear of being inconvenient. I am quieter in some ways, louder in others, more careful with promises, less afraid of discomfort. This is not a redemption arc, it's a reconstruction. And reconstruction, unlike repair, leaves the scars visible. There is a clean lie we like to tell ourselves about mistakes like mine. We say they happened because someone was weak, or selfish, or reckless. We reduce complex lives into simple warnings and tell ourselves we would never do something like that, because we don't see ourselves in the story. I understand the comfort of that distance. I used to stand there too. But the truth is quieter and more uncomfortable. Most irreversible mistakes don't begin with malice. They begin with avoidance, with unspoken needs, with years of choosing peace over presence, until one choice breaks everything you were trying to preserve. What I did was wrong, not because it violated a rule, but because it transferred pain to people who trusted me not to. No amount of self-awareness changes that. No explanation lightens that weight. If there is a lesson here, it isn't never cheat. That's too easy, too shallow. The real lesson is this: silence is not neutral, it is a decision, and decisions compound. Every time you swallow something that matters, you train the people around you to live without knowing you. Every time you choose invisibility to keep things smooth, you shrink the space where honesty could have lived. Eventually, that space collapses. I lost a 10-year marriage. I lost daily proximity to my children. I lost the version of myself that believed doing the right thing automatically protected you from catastrophic choices. What I gained is not balance, not closure, but clarity. Clarity that love cannot survive on function alone. Clarity that reliability without visibility breeds resentment. Clarity that difficult conversations delayed do not disappear. They metastasize. If you are listening to this and thinking, I feel unseen too, I am not telling you that my path is inevitable. It isn't. There were exits long before the line I crossed. Conversations I could have had. Discomfort I could have survived. The cost of those conversations would have been temporary. The cost of my choice is permanent. This story isn't here to scare you or absolve me. It's here to slow you down long enough to ask yourself where you've been quiet out of fear, and what that silence might be teaching the people who love you. So I'll end with one question, and I ask it without judgment. In your life right now, what truth are you postponing because it feels easier to carry alone? And what might it cost if you keep waiting? Thank you for listening.